October 2023 marked 1 full year since Ethan Brooks disappeared. And in that time, everything that once defined Daniel Brooks had quietly dissolved. In Phoenix, where reputation and success often determined a person's place in the world, Daniel had once stood as a figure people recognized. An investor, a builder, a man whose name carried weight across contracts and glass offices. None of that held meaning anymore. What remained was a father moving through each day with a single purpose that refused to fade. Finding his son, the routine had become fixed long ago. Every morning began with the same decision not to stop. Every street, every neighborhood, every public board that allowed a sheet of paper became part of a silent map he followed. The posters had changed over time, newer prints replacing faded ones. But the image never changed. A boy with a quiet smile and wide eyes. 8 years old, missing. People had stopped noticing. At first, there had been attention, local coverage, shared posts, brief concern that flickered and then moved on. Phoenix was a city of movement, of constant transition. Stories that did not resolve quickly were left behind. Daniel understood that now. The city had continued forward, but he had remained exactly where everything had broken. The search expanded beyond the places he once knew. Neighborhoods he had never entered before became part of his daily path. Areas where the signs of struggle were more visible, where people kept to themselves, where questions were met with silence. It was no longer about comfort or familiarity. It was about possibility, however small. By late afternoon, the pattern repeated itself again. Another street, another wall, another attempt to place the same image into a world that had learned to ignore it. Time had worn down the edges of hope, but it had not erased it, not completely. That was when something changed. A voice, small and certain, interrupted the rhythm that had defined the past year. It did not carry hesitation. It did not sound like curiosity or confusion, carried recognition. A young girl, no older than 7, stood near the edge of the street, looking directly at the image Daniel held. Her clothes and presence reflected a life shaped by limits, but her expression held none of the uncertainty adults often showed when faced with a stranger's grief. There was clarity in the way she looked at the photograph, as if she were not seeing something unfamiliar, but confirming something she already knew. What she said did not echo like a question. It landed with the weight of a fact. The boy in the picture lived in her house. For a moment, the world that had been defined by repetition broke apart. The exhaustion, the months of unanswered questions, the slow erosion of belief. All of it collided with a single statement that refused to fit into the pattern of false leads and empty guesses Daniel had grown used to dismissing. There had been tips before, dozens of them. Each one had led nowhere. Each one had carried just enough hope to reopen the same wound. But this was different. The details followed without prompting. The girl described a child who did not speak much, who kept to himself, who cried at night in a way that suggested something deeper than fear. There was mention of a name, one that belonged to Daniel, repeated in sleep, not understood but remembered. Nothing about it sounded invented. Nothing about it resembled the vague assumptions that had defined every other dead end. Hope, something Daniel had learned to control, began to return in a way that felt dangerous. The distance between disbelief and certainty narrowed with each detail. There was no immediate explanation. No clear logic that could explain how a child missing for a year could exist quietly inside a stranger's home. But logic had stopped guiding this search long ago. What remained was instinct, and instinct refused to ignore what stood in front of him. The girl did not hesitate when asked if the place was far. It was close, just around the corner. The simplicity of that answer carried its own weight. A year of searching, and the possibility of truth existed within walking distance of a place he had already passed countless times. There was a pause, not of uncertainty, but of consequence, the kind that separates a moment before everything changes from everything that comes after. Then the direction was given. A house with blue-framed windows. The image settled in Daniel's mind immediately, not as a confirmed destination, but as something that now existed with meaning. The search, which had stretched across an entire city, suddenly narrowed into a single point. For the first time in a long time, the next step was no longer uncertain. It was inevitable. The statement did not fade after it was spoken. It stayed in place, fixed in Daniel Brooks's mind with a clarity that refused to weaken under doubt. Over the past year, he had learned to measure every piece of information against the weight of disappointment. Most leads collapsed within minutes. Some lasted hours. A few extended into days before dissolving into nothing. What the girl had said did not behave like those. It did not feel like something borrowed from rumor or shaped by imagination. It carried detail, consistency, and something harder to define recognition. The possibility that Ethan could be within reach forced Daniel into a different state of thinking. The search had always been wide, scattered across distance and probability. Now it narrowed into a single direction. The distance the girl described was not symbolic or uncertain. It was immediate, close enough that the entire past year began to feel distorted, as if everything had been circling around a truth that had remained hidden in plain sight. The decision to follow her did not come with hesitation. There was no calculation left to make. The risk of being wrong no longer outweighed the risk of ignoring what might be real. For the first time in months, Daniel was not moving blindly. He was moving towards something specific. The girl led with quiet certainty. She did not appear confused or unsure, and she did not attempt to adjust her words when Daniel focused on details. She repeated the same points without contradiction. A boy, quiet, alone, different from other children. The kind of presence that stood out inside a home that otherwise seemed ordinary. The repetition of a name in his sleep, not understood by her, but remembered clearly enough to matter. Each detail reinforced the last. None of it matched the pattern of random tips Daniel had learned to dismiss. There was structure in what she said, and structure suggested truth. When they reached the house, Daniel did not experience the relief he had imagined during countless nights of searching. Instead, a different kind of tension took hold. The house itself did not present an answer. It represented a boundary. Everything that had led him there existed on one side. Everything that could confirm or destroy what he hoped existed on the other. The girl identified it without hesitation. The windows, painted in a faded shade of blue, became the only fixed point in Daniel's perception. The search, which had once been defined by movement, now condensed into stillness. There was no longer a need to go further. The answer, whatever it was, existed here. The approach required control. Over the past year, Daniel had learned that urgency often led to mistakes. But urgency had also driven him through places he would never have entered otherwise. Now, both instincts existed at the same time, forcing him to balance restraint with the need to act before the moment could slip away. The door opened after a pause that felt longer than it was. The woman who stood there introduced herself without offering information beyond what was necessary. Megan Carter. Her tone remained measured, but her reaction to the name Ethan Brooks did not go unnoticed. It appeared briefly, almost hidden, but it existed. A disruption in composure that could not be fully concealed. Daniel presented the situation directly. A missing child. A year without answers. A statement made by someone who lived inside this house. There was no attempt to dramatize or persuade. The facts alone were enough. Megan's response followed quickly, and it followed a familiar structure. Denial clear and immediate. No child, no misunderstanding, only herself and her daughter. The certainty in her words did not eliminate the inconsistency in her reaction. Instead, it deepened it. The explanation she offered for her daughter's statement rested on assumption rather than evidence. Children imagine things. Children misunderstand. Children confuse faces and stories. It was a reasonable argument, one that could have ended the conversation under different circumstances. But the details Daniel had heard did not align with simple imagination. They aligned with experience. The difference between those two possibilities remained unresolved, and that uncertainty became the center of the moment. Daniel did not press beyond a certain point. The situation required confirmation, not escalation. He stated his purpose clearly: verification, nothing more. A request to see, to confirm, to eliminate doubt in one direction or the other. It was the simplest form of resolution available. The refusal that followed carried more weight than the words themselves. It was not only a denial of access. It was a refusal to allow clarity to exist. That refusal changed the structure of the situation. It introduced a new variable, intent. The interaction ended without resolution. The door closed, and with it any direct path to confirmation. But the absence of proof did not return Daniel to where he had been before. It moved him somewhere else entirely. Before that moment, the search had been defined by uncertainty without direction. Now, uncertainty had a location. It had a specific place, a specific person, and a specific contradiction that could not be ignored. For the first time in a year, Daniel was no longer searching for where to look. He knew exactly where the truth was hiding. The refusal at the door did not settle anything. It only changed the shape of the question. What had once been uncertainty spread across an entire city now focused entirely on one place, one house, one name that no longer felt coincidental. Daniel Brooks did not return to the pattern that had defined the previous year. He did not move on to another street or another set of walls. The search had narrowed, and with that narrowing came a different kind of pressure, one that no longer allowed distance from the truth. At the same time, inside the house, something else had already begun to shift. Lily Carter had lived within a structure where certain things were accepted without question. There were routines, limits, and spaces that were not meant to be explored. The room at the back of the house had always existed as one of those limits. It remained closed, explained only in passing, never discussed in detail. For a long time, that absence of explanation had been enough. Children adapt to boundaries when they are consistent. They learn where not to look, what not to ask, and how to move within what is given. But the encounter with Daniel disrupted that pattern. The image on the poster had connected directly to something Lily had already noticed but never fully understood. The quiet presence in the house, the absence of explanation, the feeling that something existed just outside what was allowed to be seen. What had once been vague became specific the moment she recognized the face in the photograph. The connection formed instantly without confusion, without doubt. That realization did not disappear when the door closed. It remained active, shaping how she understood everything around her. Her mother's reaction had not matched the simplicity of her words. The denial had come too quickly, too completely. It did not leave room for consideration, and that lack of space created its own kind of signal. Lily did not have the language to define it in adult terms, but she understood it in the way children often understand what is not being said. That night, the house did not return to normal. Silence carried a different meaning. It was no longer just the absence of noise. It felt intentional, as if something was being held in place, controlled. Lily remained aware of the back room in a way she had never been before. Awareness replaced habit. Curiosity replaced acceptance. Then the sound came. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was distinct enough to separate itself from everything else. A voice, strained and uncertain, repeating something that did not belong to the house. It did not resemble conversation. It resembled memory, a word carried out of sleep, not meant for anyone present. The word matched what Daniel had described. That single connection eliminated the last barrier between suspicion and belief. There was no longer a question of whether the man at the door had been mistaken. There was only the reality that something hidden inside the house was directly tied to him. Lily's understanding changed completely in that moment. The room was no longer just a closed space. It became the center of everything. The place where the explanation existed, where the contradiction between what was said and what was real could no longer be ignored. The more she listened, the clearer it became that the sound was not temporary. It was part of something ongoing, something that had existed before she recognized it. The absence of answers began to feel intentional. That realization carried weight beyond curiosity. It introduced a sense of responsibility, one that did not come from instruction, but from awareness. The man who had stood outside the house was not searching randomly. He was searching for something that existed here. The connection between them had already been established. Whether anyone acknowledged it or not, fear existed alongside that realization, but it did not erase it. Children often accept explanations without question, But once a contradiction becomes clear, it is difficult to return to that state. Lily could no longer pretend that what she had heard did not matter. The house itself no longer felt neutral. It felt divided, one part visible, one part hidden, with a clear line between them. The night passed without resolution, but not without change. By morning, the structure that had once defined what was allowed and what was not had already begun to weaken. The back room no longer represented a boundary to respect. It represented something to understand. The sound from the night before remained in Lily's mind, repeating in the same way it had repeated from behind the door. There was no longer any doubt that the truth existed within reach. The only question left was how to reach it without being stopped. And for the first time, the answer did not feel impossible. The night had already altered everything before morning arrived. The sound that had come from behind the closed door did not fade with sleep because sleep never fully came. It stayed present, repeating in memory with the same fragile clarity, the same quiet urgency that made it impossible to dismiss. By the time daylight returned, Lily Carter was no longer uncertain about what she had heard or what it meant. The difference between suspicion and belief had already been crossed. From that point forward, the house no longer functioned as it had before. Every space carried a second layer of meaning, one that did not match what was visible. The back room, once accepted as something off limits without question, now existed as the center of everything that no longer made sense. The explanation given for it had never been detailed, and that absence of detail now felt intentional rather than normal. The problem was not understanding that something was wrong. The problem was access. The door remained closed, unchanged from every day before. No explanation had been added. No new rule introduced. Everything on the surface remained consistent. That consistency itself became part of the tension because it suggested that whatever was hidden had been hidden carefully, deliberately over time. Lily began to look for something that did not rely on permission. The idea did not come from defiance. It came from necessity. The voice she had heard the night before had not sounded temporary. It had not suggested something passing or accidental. It suggested presence, ongoing, contained, and controlled. That realization made waiting impossible. The first attempt to reach the room directly produced nothing. The barrier between what was allowed and what was hidden held in place exactly as it had before. There was no change, no weakness, no simple way through. The structure that kept the room separate had been built to remain that way. That failure did not end the effort. It redirected it. If the room could not be opened from the outside, then the answer had to exist somewhere else. Not in the room itself, but in whatever had made it necessary to keep it closed. The idea that something physical might exist, something written, recorded, or stored, became the next focus. Not because it was certain, but because it was the only remaining path that did not depend on access to the door. The search shifted into a different form. Lily began to pay attention to details that had never mattered before. Not obvious things, but small inconsistencies. Objects that did not belong to daily routines. Spaces that seemed to hold more than they should. The kind of things that would not stand out unless someone was looking for a reason to question them. That process took time, but it did not feel slow. Every moment carried urgency now because the connection to the boy behind the door was no longer abstract. It was direct, real, immediate. The discovery did not come as something dramatic. It appeared in a place that had always existed, unnoticed because there had never been a reason to look closely. A section of the floor that did not sit exactly as it should. A difference so small it could be ignored unless someone was searching specifically for something hidden. Once noticed, it could not be ignored. What lay beneath it was not random, a wrapped object, protected but not secured in a way that suggested it was meant to remain hidden indefinitely. Something meant to be concealed but not destroyed. That distinction mattered. It suggested that whatever was inside had value, not just secrecy. The object revealed itself as a notebook. Its condition showed time, use, and repetition. This was not something new. It had been written in, added to, returned to more than once. The contents confirmed what Lily had already begun to suspect, but in a way that removed all remaining doubt. Names, dates, short, fragmented notes that did not explain themselves, but carried a pattern that became clear with each page. The entries did not resemble anything ordinary. They were not records of daily life. They were not personal thoughts. They were transactions, movements, something structured and deliberate. And then, among those names, one appeared that did not belong to the rest. In Lily's mind, Ethan Brooks. The recognition was immediate. There was no need to question whether it was the same person. The connection had already been established before the name was ever seen. The voice, the photograph, the description, all of it aligned in a way that made coincidence impossible. The words written beside the name did not provide comfort. They did not offer explanation in a way that made sense. Instead, they suggested something far more serious. Terms that implied transfer, absence, silence. Not language used for care or protection, but for control. The notebook transformed everything. What had once been suspicion became evidence. Not complete, not fully understood, but real enough to change the situation entirely. The house was no longer just a place where something felt wrong. It was part of something larger, something organized, something that extended beyond a single room. The realization brought with it a new kind of urgency. This was no longer just about understanding what was behind the door. It was about what would happen if nothing was done. The name written in that notebook connected the boy in the house to something that existed outside of it, something that had already taken action once and could do so again. Keeping the information hidden was no longer an option. The risk of being discovered was real, but it no longer outweighed the risk of doing nothing. The connection to Daniel Brooks, the man who had come to the door, became the only path forward. He was not part of the structure that had created the situation. He was outside it, searching for it. And now, for the first time, Lily had something he did not. Proof. The rain had already begun by the time Lily stepped away from the house, but it did not slow her down or change her direction. The notebook had altered everything in a way that could not be reversed. It was no longer a question of whether the boy behind the locked door existed or whether he was connected to the man who had come searching. That connection had been confirmed in writing, in a form that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding or coincidence. The only thing left was action. Lily understood, in the simple but absolute way children sometimes do, that waiting would only make things worse. The presence of the notebook meant that what was happening inside the house was not isolated. It was part of something organized, something that had already made decisions before she ever became aware of it. That realization removed any sense that time could be taken for granted. The longer nothing was done, the greater the risk that whatever had brought Ethan into that house could take him somewhere else. She did not need to think about where to go. Daniel Brooks had made himself impossible to miss over the past year. His presence in the city had become part of its background, even for people who never spoke to him. Lily had seen him before the day he came to the house. She had seen the posters, the repetition, the persistence that did not stop even when no one responded. That persistence now became the only reason she believed he would still be there. And he was, the same pattern continued, unchanged despite everything that had happened. The same effort, the same image, the same refusal to let time erase what mattered. When Lily approached him, there was no need to explain why she had come. The urgency existed in the way she held what she had found, in the way she did not hesitate. The paper she carried was not large, but it held more weight than anything Daniel had encountered in a year. When he saw the name written on it, Ethan Brooks, everything else stopped. The search, the exhaustion, the long chain of false leads, all of it collapsed into a single point of clarity. This was no longer possibility. It was confirmation. The detail mattered as much as the name itself. It was not just that Ethan's name appeared. It was how it appeared, written in a system that included other names, other entries, other indications that what had happened to his son was part of something structured. The words surrounding the name did not provide comfort. They suggested movement, control, and an attempt to erase traceable identity. The implication was immediate and unavoidable. Ethan had not simply been taken. He had been processed. The realization changed Daniel completely. For a year, he had lived in a state of controlled hope, forcing himself to believe without evidence because there was no other option. Now evidence existed, and it brought with it something far more dangerous than hope. It brought certainty mixed with fear, because certainty meant the situation was worse than anything he had allowed himself to imagine. There was no hesitation in what came next. The house with the blue-framed windows was no longer just a place of suspicion. It was the center of the truth. The refusal from the previous day no longer held the same power. That refusal had depended on the absence of proof. Now proof existed, and it changed the balance completely. When Daniel returned, he was no longer searching. He was confronting. The second interaction did not follow the same pattern as the first. The presence of evidence removed the ability to rely on simple denial. When Megan Carter appeared again, the shift in Daniel's position was clear. He did not ask for information in the same way. He presented what he knew. The name, the connection, the fact that the information had come from inside the house itself. The reaction that followed was no longer controlled in the same way as before. The structure of denial began to weaken under the pressure of specifics. The notebook had removed ambiguity. It had created a situation where silence or dismissal would no longer be enough. Then something else confirmed it. A sound from within the house. Not loud, not clear enough to form complete understanding, but unmistakably present. The same kind of sound Lily had heard the night before. Weak, contained, and impossible to explain away as anything else. At that point, the situation reached a threshold. Daniel no longer needed permission to believe what he already knew. The barrier between suspicion and action disappeared. The door, which had represented separation, now represented obstruction. And obstruction, in this context, carried meaning that could not be ignored. Everything that followed moved quickly, not because of impulse, but because the conditions no longer allowed delay. The presence of the child, the confirmation of identity, the evidence of a larger structure behind it. All of it combined into a single reality that demanded immediate resolution. The truth was no longer hidden. It was contained, and containment could not last much longer. The threshold had already been crossed before the door gave way. What followed was no longer part of a search or even a confrontation. It was the moment where everything hidden became unavoidable. The structure that had held the situation together, denial, silence, controlled access, collapsed under the combined weight of evidence, urgency, and the undeniable presence of a child inside. Daniel Brooks did not enter that moment as someone uncertain. The year of searching had stripped away hesitation. What remained was focus, sharpened by the confirmation he now carried. Every step forward was driven by one fact that no longer allowed delay. Ethan was there. The room that had remained closed for so long was no longer protected by explanation or distance. Once it was opened, the truth it contained did not require interpretation. It did not need to be pieced together slowly. It existed fully, immediately, in a form that matched everything Daniel had feared and everything he had hoped at the same time. Ethan Brooks had not disappeared into absence. He had been kept. The recognition between father and son did not depend on words or confirmation. It existed in the simple, undeniable alignment between memory and reality. A year of uncertainty ended in a single moment of clarity that could not be reversed. The search, which had stretched across months and miles, resolved into something immediate and human. But that moment did not exist in isolation. The presence of Ethan in that room did not stand alone. It was connected to everything the notebook had suggested, everything Lily had uncovered, everything that had made the situation far more complex than a single act of wrongdoing. The house was not the origin. It was a point within something larger. Megan Carter's role became unavoidable the moment the room was opened. Her position in the situation had always been uncertain, defined by contradiction rather than clarity. Her denial, her reaction, the hidden notebook, all of it pointed toward involvement, but not necessarily control. When confronted with the reality that could no longer be denied, that ambiguity began to resolve. She did not present herself as someone who had created the situation. She presented herself as someone trapped within it. The explanation that followed did not attempt to remove responsibility entirely, but it reframed it. The child had not come into her home by her decision alone. Pressure had been applied from outside, from individuals who operated beyond the boundaries of what could be easily resisted. The notebook, the structure of names and dates, the language used to describe movement and control, all of it pointed to a system that extended far beyond a single address. Fear had shaped her choices. Not the kind of fear that disappears when confronted, but the kind that builds over time, reinforced by threat and isolation. Reporting what had happened had never felt like a real option to her. Not because she did not understand the consequences, but because she believed those consequences would reach beyond her. That belief had kept the situation contained. But containment depended on silence, and silence had already been broken. The presence of Daniel, the involvement of Lily, the evidence that had been uncovered, all of it had disrupted the structure that had allowed the situation to continue. What had once been controlled was now exposed. The situation escalated again when another presence entered the equation. The existence of a broader network had never been hypothetical. It had been implied from the beginning, embedded in the way the notebook recorded information, in the way the child had been kept, in the way Megan had reacted under pressure. When that presence became direct, it confirmed what had already been suspected. This was not a single isolated act. It was part of something organized. The man who appeared represented that structure, not in explanation but in intent. His presence carried urgency of a different kind, one that suggested awareness of disruption. The system that had been operating quietly had recognized that something had changed. But the situation no longer allowed control to return to where it had been. Daniel was no longer acting alone, and Megan was no longer maintaining silence. The existence of the child, the exposure of the notebook, the involvement of multiple people, all of it had created a moment where the structure behind the situation could not simply reassert itself without consequence. What followed did not require escalation into chaos to be decisive. The shift had already happened. The truth had been revealed, and once revealed, it could not be contained again in the same way. The attempt to maintain control weakened under the weight of visibility. The balance that had once favored secrecy now favored exposure. Daniel's focus never moved away from Ethan. Everything else, the explanation, the presence of others, the broader implications, existed around that central reality. The child who had been missing for a year was no longer missing. He was present, alive, and no longer hidden. That fact alone ended the search. But it did not end the consequences. The house, the people within it, and the system connected to it would all face what came next. Authorities would become involved. Investigations would begin. The notebook would not remain just an object. It would become evidence. The names written within it would lead beyond what had already been uncovered. But in that moment, before any of that unfolded, one thing became final. Daniel Brooks left that place with his son. The reign that had begun earlier continued. But it no longer carried the same meaning. What had once symbolized persistence without result now marked the end of a year defined by uncertainty. The search was over. The truth had been found. And nothing that came next could undo that. The moment Daniel Brooks left the house with Ethan did not bring closure in the way he had imagined during the past year. It marked an end, but also the beginning of something else. Something structured, procedural, and unavoidable. The reality of what had happened could not remain contained within a single moment of reunion. It had to be examined, documented, and understood. Ethan was taken directly into medical care, not as a formality but as a necessity. A year of absence could not be reduced to a simple return. There were physical and psychological conditions that needed to be assessed carefully without assumption. In the United States, cases involving missing children followed strict protocols once recovery occurred. Authorities did not treat the situation as resolved simply because the child had been found. Recovery was only the first step. Daniel remained present, but his role shifted. For a year, he had been the one searching, pushing forward without structure, driven by instinct and persistence. Now that role transferred to institutions designed to handle what came next. Law enforcement, child protective services, medical professionals, all of them became part of the process. Each step followed procedures that Daniel could not control, even if he understood why they existed. Ethan's condition stabilized quickly, but stabilization did not mean recovery was complete. There were questions that could not be answered immediately, and there were answers that could not be forced. The priority was not information. It was safety and care. At the same time, the situation expanded beyond the immediate family. The Phoenix Police Department began a full investigation using the notebook as the central piece of evidence. What had once been a hidden record inside a private home was now part of a formal case. Each name, each date, each fragmented note became a point of analysis. The structure that Lily had uncovered was no longer theoretical. It was documented. Megan Carter was taken into custody, but her position within the case remained complex. From the outside, her role appeared direct. A missing child had been found inside her home. That fact alone carried legal consequences. But the investigation did not stop at what was visible. It examined context, patterns, and connections. Megan's statements aligned with what the notebook suggested. She had not operated independently. Her involvement existed within a larger system. That system became the focus of the investigation. Authorities traced the entries in the notebook, looking for links between names, locations, and timelines. The pattern that emerged confirmed what Daniel had already feared. This was not a single incident. It was part of a network that moved children across locations, relying on individuals placed in different positions to maintain control without drawing attention. The man who had appeared at the house was identified quickly. His connection to the network was stronger, more direct, and less ambiguous. Unlike Megan, his role did not involve hesitation or fear. It involved execution. His arrest marked a critical point in the case, not because it ended the investigation, but because it provided access to a deeper level of the structure. The case expanded beyond Phoenix. Federal agencies became involved as soon as the interstate elements were confirmed. In the United States, crimes involving trafficking, especially involving minors, triggered coordination across multiple levels of law enforcement. What had begun as a missing persons case now entered a different category entirely. Daniel watched this process unfold with a sense of distance. For a year, everything had been personal, immediate, and singular. Now, the situation existed within systems that operated on a scale far beyond his direct influence. Reports were filed. Evidence was cataloged. Interviews were conducted. The emotional weight of the situation remained, but it was now surrounded by procedures that did not change based on individual experience. In the middle of all of this, one fact remained constant. Ethan was alive. That fact carried Daniel through every moment of uncertainty that followed. It did not erase what had happened, and it did not simplify what came next, but it provided a foundation that had been missing for an entire year. At the same time, another part of the story continued quietly, almost unnoticed within the larger investigation. Lily Carter's role in what had happened was clear to those who understood the case. Without her actions, the situation might have remained hidden much longer. The notebook would not have been discovered. The connection would not have been confirmed, and Daniel might have continued searching without direction. But recognition did not immediately translate into stability. Lily did not remain in the house after everything was uncovered. The legal consequences of the situation extended to her as well, not because of wrongdoing, but because of circumstance. With Megan in custody and no other immediate guardian present, Lily was placed into the child welfare system. This transition followed standard procedures. In cases where a parent is removed from custody, the state assumes temporary responsibility for the child. Placement decisions are made based on availability, safety, and long-term planning. It is a system designed to protect, but it is also one that often places children into environments that are unfamiliar and uncertain. Lily moved from a house where everything had been hidden to a system where everything was structured. The shift was immediate and complete. She was no longer part of the investigation in the same way. Her role had already been fulfilled. What remained for her was a future that had not yet been defined, one that would depend on decisions made by people she did not know. Daniel became aware of this only after the initial stages of the investigation had settled. At first, his focus remained entirely on Ethan. Recovery, stability, and the gradual process of rebuilding a sense of normal life took priority. But as those immediate needs began to stabilize, the broader context of what had happened became clearer. Lily had not just provided information. She had changed the outcome. That realization stayed with Daniel even as everything else continued to move forward. The system would handle the investigation. The legal process would determine accountability. But there were parts of the story that existed outside those structures, and Lily was one of them. The days that followed did not return to what Daniel Brooks once understood as normal. Normal had been replaced by structure, by careful routines shaped around recovery rather than assumption. Ethan remained under supervision at first, not because of immediate danger, but because the impact of a year spent in isolation could not be measured quickly. Professionals monitored his condition, not searching for dramatic signs, but for subtle shifts that would indicate how deeply the experience had affected him. Daniel stayed close, but he learned something difficult during that time. Recovery was not something he could control. Even though the instinct to protect had guided him for so long, the process required patience, consistency, and restraint. It required him to accept that being present mattered more than forcing progress. Ethan began to stabilize, not in a sudden way but gradually. Small changes appeared. First, awareness, recognition, the ability to engage with what was happening around him without withdrawing completely. Each of these moments carried significance, even if they seemed minor to anyone outside the situation. For Daniel, they represented something far greater than recovery. They represented return. But Ethan's return was not defined only by what he had survived. It was also defined by what he remembered. Among those memories, one remained constant. Lily. The name appeared again and again, not as a distant detail, but as something central to how Ethan understood the time he had been kept hidden. He did not describe events in full, and no one expected him to. But the presence of Lily existed in a way that made it clear she had not simply been part of the same environment. She had been different. She had been the one who did not belong to the silence. Daniel began to understand what that meant. Lily had not just discovered the truth. She had resisted it. That realization carried weight far beyond gratitude. It created a sense of responsibility that Daniel could not ignore. The system that had taken over her life now treated her case as one among many. Placement decisions, evaluations, future planning, all of it followed standard procedures. Those procedures existed for a reason, but they did not account for what she had done. She had changed the outcome. Daniel requested information through the proper channels. The process was not immediate. Privacy laws, child protection policies, and legal considerations created layers that could not be bypassed simply because he wanted answers. But persistence, the same persistence that had defined the past year, remained part of who he was. Eventually, he learned where she had been placed. A temporary foster arrangement designed to provide stability until a longer-term solution could be determined. It was not permanent. It was not certain. It was a system in motion, still deciding what her future would look like. Daniel did not approach the situation impulsively. He understood that involvement required more than intention. It required approval, evaluation, and a demonstration that what he offered would truly serve her best interest. In the United States, becoming part of a child's life through the system meant entering a process that was designed to prevent further harm. It was not enough to care. It had to be proven that care could be sustained. He began that process without hesitation. Meetings were scheduled. Background evaluations were conducted. Questions were asked that extended beyond his past into his present and future. His financial stability, his living situation, his capacity to provide emotional support. All of it became part of an assessment that determined whether he could play a role in Lily's life. At the same time, Ethan continued to recover. The connection between the two children remained present, even though they were no longer in the same place. Ethan's references to Lily did not fade as his condition improved. If anything, they became clearer. She was not just part of his memory. She was part of his survival. That connection became part of Daniel's case. It was no longer only about gratitude. It was about continuity. The system recognized this slowly but carefully. The idea that maintaining that connection could support both children began to take shape within the process. When Daniel was finally allowed to see Lily, the moment did not carry the intensity of discovery or confrontation. It carried something quieter, but just as significant: recognition. Lily understood immediately why he had come. She did not need an explanation because the outcome of her actions had already been clear to her long before anyone else confirmed it. What she had done had not been driven by expectation of reward. It had been driven by a simple understanding that something wrong needed to be changed. Daniel expressed what could not be measured in simple terms. Gratitude not as a formality but as something rooted in the reality that his son would not be there without her. That truth did not depend on the legal process or the investigation. It existed independently as a fact that would never change. What followed did not happen immediately. The system moved at its own pace as it was designed to do. But the direction had already been set. Daniel did not step away. He remained present, consistent, committed, not as someone attempting to replace what Lily had lost, but as someone offering stability where uncertainty had taken over. Eventually, the decision was made. Lily would not return to a system that treated her as a temporary case. She would move into a life where she was known, valued, and supported. Not because she had earned it through what she had done, but because she deserved it regardless. Daniel's home changed again. It was no longer defined by absence. It was no longer shaped by a single story of loss. It became something else. Something built from what had been recovered and what had been given freely without expectation. Ethan continued to heal. Lily began to adjust. And Daniel, for the first time in a long time, understood that the end of one search had led to something he had not been looking for, but needed just as much. The investigation continued in the background. The network was dismantled piece by piece. Legal consequences followed. Systems worked as they were meant to, but those outcomes, while necessary, did not define what remained most important. What remained was simpler. A child who survived, a child who chose to act, and an adult who chose not to look away when both of those truths came together. In a world where people often move past what does not affect them directly, the difference between silence and action can decide everything. Sometimes it takes someone with nothing to gain to change the outcome for someone who has lost everything. And sometimes the people who save a life are not the ones with power, but the ones who refuse to accept that something wrong should be left alone. That is where real change begins. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your presence here means more than you might realize. In a world that moves fast and often forgets, choosing to pause and truly listen to a story like this is already something meaningful. What we've just gone through is not only a story about loss and reunion, but also a reminder of how fragile and valuable human connection really is. A father who refused to give up even after an entire year of silence. A child who endured more than anyone should have to. And most importantly, a young girl who chose to act when she could have stayed silent. These are not just characters in a story. They represent choices we all face in different ways. Sometimes the difference between darkness and hope is not power, not status, but a simple decision to speak up, to care, and to not ignore what feels wrong. This story quietly reminds us that even the smallest voice can change the course of someone else's life. And in many cases, it's not about doing something extraordinary, but about not turning away when it matters most. If the story moved you, if it made you think or feel even for a moment, then that means it has already done something important. And if you would like to support what we do here, it's actually very simple. You can help us continue sharing meaningful stories like this by leaving a like, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows these stories to reach more people, people who may need to hear them, people who may see themselves in them, and people who may be inspired to act differently because of them. Thank you once again for being here, for listening, and for choosing to care.